bit about the Coast Guard and how we deal with maritime domain awareness, as well as IUU fishing. I can't start my talk without going into at least a little bit of Coast Guard strategy, having come from the Coast Guard headquarters and dealing with strategy. So it's amazing to me that as far as the Coast Guard goes, there's a lot of misunderstanding amongst folks of what the U.S. Coast Guard does. And I think it's because we do things from port buoys on the Mississippi River to manage bridge administration to counter drug work down off of South America. I think to caveat it best is to say that the mission of the United States Coast Guard is to ensure the safety, security, and stewardship of our nation's waters. So to put that in layman's terms, we protect those on the sea, we protect the nation from threats delivered by the sea, and we protect the sea itself. How do we do that? I like to say we do it through a strategy of prevent and respond. We hopefully prevent bad things from happening, whether they're man-made or not, and respond when bad things do happen. How do we do that? We do it through four interrelated and coordinated activities. We monitor, we operate, we regulate, and we enforce. We're a unique instrument in the U.S. government because we actually operate in the environment in which we regulate and enforce. So a unique instrument from the U.S. government standpoint. How do we do that? Being a small service, we have about 42,000 actually uniformed members in the U.S. Coast Guard. So to carry out a mission of that nature, we're able to do that through three pieces that are basically what I consider our strategic enablers, which are partnerships, authorities, and actual presence. I apologize for the cartoonish slide, but I mean, I try to get it across to where we take this mission, and this is how we come down, and this is the expensive piece down here. These are how we project presence, whether it's via people, whether it's via ships, aircraft, and we basically have, according to the U.S. law, have 11 statutory missions that we have to accomplish. And I went over some of them. Most people are familiar with the Coast Guard as far as search and rescue goes. But today, since the topic is IUU fishing, I really want to concentrate on the last two I listed on this list, which is living marine resource law enforcement, other law enforcement. The other law enforcement is just internationally working for combating illegal fishing. So how do we organize ourselves? We like to consider ourselves a trident force in how we actually carry this out. We have shore-based forces. That can be your intel staff. That can be folks like me that do operational planning. It can be your logistics staff behind the scenes that are making sure our ships and aircraft have parts, as well as headquarters level that are actually doing setting policy for the Coast Guard. Then we actually have our maritime patrol assets, which are ships and aircraft that are actually out there doing the mission. We also have deployable specialized forces, which are our special teams that actually go out and whether they're maritime security specialists or whatever that actually go in and do this. As you can see, that's quite a bit. As small as the service is, it's very important for the Coast Guard to think, how can we do things better, efficiently? Again, harnessing technology is one way to do that. But it takes a little bit of time the way the Coast Guard works, like any government agency, the way the budget process works. By the time we work through our budget cycle and actually acquire something, we're 3-4 years behind technology. So a perfect example of that was today. I was supposed to go earlier, but my presentation was developed on an operating system that was so outdated they couldn't read it when I brought it in. So, I had to jump into the hoops and save it to the PDF and get it over here. But the ultimate goal is for the Coast Guard is to do this. Having good maritime domain awareness is very important, so we can actually target where we're actually putting our resources. So Coast Guard considers MDA the effective understanding of activities, events, and threats in the maritime environment that could impact global safety, security, economic activity, as well as the environment. To put it in perspective, since we're talking about IUU fishing, the fishing industry alone brings in about $143 billion into the U.S. economy. So that's a huge part of the U.S. economy. So it's very important that we play a role in making sure that that's being done properly. So how do we put our resources where they need to go? It requires a lot of work. Here's an example of a fused product put together for Operation Salmon Slayer in 2013. It's basically a layers historic enforcement data, AIS, VMS data, commercial imagery, environmental data to make operational recommendations to boarding platforms, and we have a Esri background now to show that on. This was effective, and we were actually able to, using this and getting it out and properly putting our assets where they needed to be, we conducted 39 boardings for salmon fishing, of which we noted 16 violations, and we seized catches from those violations. So how did we get to this point? It involves a process called species distribution modeling, and it's based on environmental factors to predict where the fish are, so we can, as well as where the fishing activity is going to take place. Come up with a model to then decide where we're going to put our resources. It's done through pulling off information like the daily seawater or sea temperature, as well as the chloroform levels from a NOAA buoy that's publicly available. We take that information as well as our historic enforcement data that we have. We use AIS and VMS data. So multiple layers that get put in to do this. We have to take it one step further and kind of look at where we think, based off historical, where the fishermen are going to feed. Because again, sometimes the species do move based off of lifestyles or life stage changes, as well as we talked about earlier today with climate change, that sometimes they're driving the fishing stocks to move different than what they had in the past. But then they build this model, and then from this model, they have to actually go in and validate it. So that takes time, going through and making sure it's actually bringing up good information. So because again, we don't want to allocate multi-million-dollar assets to somewhere where the fish stocks are not going to be. The idea is they run through this, so it takes, I would say, anywhere from days to weeks from a geospatial analyst and a marine scientist in order to build these. So again, taking that information and building these is time consuming, but it's important that we do this, because again, otherwise we would just be out there boring holes in the sea with our aircraft and ships trying to find out where the fishing fleet are. Some of the other initiatives we have going on, because again, as I mentioned, we can't be everywhere at all times in order to combat this. And again, we've talked a lot about maritime domain awareness. But knowing is one thing, but actually being able to do something about that and change the behavior. So the enforcement becomes a big part of that. Because if we cannot change the behavior, it's still going to be out there. We know it's going on, we can see that it's going on, but unless we change that behavior, we can't fix that. United Nations General Assembly Resolution 44 225 is a 21-year-old global moratorium on high seas drift net fishing activity. And the international implementation of that across the globe has been very, very well done. But one of the problem areas still maintains the vast North Pacific Ocean. So we still need to come up with ways to look at that. I think one of the charts shown earlier today showed that North Pacific transit route for some of the species, and it's right in that area where it's known for high seas drift net fishing. So again, we cannot, as small as the Coast Guard is, be there all the time to patrol these areas. So how do we branch out and tackle this big problem? There's operational forums. There's a North Atlantic Coast Guard forum. There's the North Pacific Coast Guard forum, which I'm most familiar with. I am the chairman of the Combined Ops work group for that international forum. And there's also a new fledgling one, which is the Arctic Coast Guard forum, which will then start looking at the Arctic. But the North Pacific Coast Guard forum is what I want to spend a little bit of time on, because that's one I know the best, because I've been part of it now for a little over a year. But I think it's the model for what the other forums should look to for as far as how we work together. So the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum was started in 2000, so this will be the 15th year of that. It involves countries from maritime organizations from Canada, China, Japan, South Korea, and Russia, as well as the United States. And we meet twice a year. Once earlier in the year, like March timeframe, we met here actually in the Bay Area in March. And it's a planet level where we plan joint operations for the year, as well as a joint exercise where we go across the many work groups we have in there, whether it's search and rescue, water pollution response, maritime security, and things along those lines. So we work together put those together, and then we actually do the operations through the summer, and then in the fall we actually bring the heads of services together, brief out what we did, and then they get together and make a commitment together for the commitment that they're going to put into next year's efforts. The great thing which makes it successful is voluntary. I mean, the work groups that come in, they all have the same ultimate goal in mind, but they also have their own needs that need to be met. But they use the forum to make that happen. So just to put it into perspective, kind of how the cooperative nature of how this works. Consider a fisheries patrol that's a joint fishery patrol where you have a U.S. Coast Guard cutter, where you have Chinese federal law enforcement shipwrighers on board. You have other patrol ships from Russia as well as South Korea. You have aircraft flying out of Japan providing area oversight, as well as the Canadian CP-140 providing information. They're all working together to provide that common picture so we can combat that high seas drift net. Because as I mentioned before, no single country has all the resources, authorities, and jurisdictions to provide that effective cover. So by working together, we can pool that together and actually make a dent in what's going on out there in our seas and make sure we're securing our fish stocks so our children have and grandchildren can continue to have sustenance as the world population continues to grow. As I mentioned about the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum, the North Pacific Guard, Operation North Pacific Guard, is actually the operational piece of the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum. So, and it specifically tackles IUU fishing. We basically support international fisheries management organizations, which are the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, the International Pacific Halibut Commission, and the International American Tropical Tuna Commission. Combined effort of sharing information as well as combining surface assets, shipwrighter agreements, and patrol aircraft, we can provide a better coverage of this vast North Pacific ocean. And it is important to all the nations. 2 years ago, the commitment across all the countries was about $7.5 million worth of investment into protecting that. This year, it will be more than $30 million. So just in a matter of 2 years, these countries have come forth and put more assets and resources out there to help combat this growing problem. Some of the other initiatives we have out there is the Oceania Maritime Security Initiative. This is an agreement between DoD, the Coast Guard, and NOAA in support of Operation Persistent Presence, pairing Navy mobility with Coast Guard authorities. As I mentioned before, we have authorities, so we don't have as many assets. We use Navy assets that have to be transiting through some of the areas we talked about this morning, put Coast Guard folks on, and actually have the authority and jurisdiction to carry out enforcement activities. On those ships also, we also tackle when I put the bilateral ship agreements, because we'll also take shipwrights from other countries where the U.S. doesn't have jurisdiction. Some of those, we have about 9 that we use routinely. So Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Cook Islands, People's Republic of China, Japan, Canada, and Taiwan, and Nauru. It's using these bilateral shipwright agreements as well as the multilateral operations, we're actually making a big effort to tackle IUU fishing. To give you some success stories based off the North Pacific Guard that I mentioned earlier, the first one, 2011, the Bang Gun Perkasa. You had the Coast Guard cutter Monroe that was operating out in the high threat area, had Chinese flight riders on board. The Japanese had aircraft that they were flying out of Japan providing aerial coverage, as well as I mentioned before, a Canadian CP-140 aircraft. They got information from the overflight of the Japanese aircraft to the Coast Guard cutter Monroe that there was a suspected illegal fisherman. So the Monroe made contact about 2,600 miles southwest of Kodiak and proceeded to make right of approach questions, and I found out that this vessel had been using more than 10 miles of drift net. They had 30 tons of squid on board, approximately 30 shark carcasses. We were able to basically, under the authorities that we had, we were able to take custody of that ship. We escorted it into Dutch Harbor, confiscated the catch, as well as that ship was then cut up and turned into scrap metal. So again, it's that enforcement piece that drives it home for these folks. The next one would be the Da Chang the following year, which the Coast Guard Cutter Rush was operating up there, had an embarked helicopter on board. They spotted a vessel and decided that something didn't look right, so they went up. The ship claimed Indonesian registry and said they had 30 pounds of tuna on board, 5 to 6 tons of shark, and 500 kilograms of shark fin. But then the master also admitted that he had used high-seas drift net. So given that he claimed Indonesian registry and with the highly migratory species on board, and the fact that it did not appear on the Western and Central Pacific Commission's record of authorized fishing vessels, the Coast Guard went ahead and we under the authorities given by the Western Pacific Fisheries Commission, boarded that vessel and found out they did have 10 miles of high seas drift net material on board and had used it multiple times during that claim. Due to the discrepancy in what the claimant for registry was, we had to give a statement of no objections and to actually do the boarding. We did the boarding, but then we turned custody of the ship over to China because we have a relationship with China. They actually took custody. We jointly escorted the ship back to China, and they sold the fish at auction to recover that, and then they also destroyed the ship. So again, bilateral agreements working jointly with other countries to pull off, another good one that hopefully changes behavior out there as far as high seas drift net fishing. The last one was the most recent one, which just happened in August of last year, which was a fishing vessel, Taiji. This one highlights work between Canada, the U.S., and Russia. It was late in the fishing season. We saw a vessel, but it was so close to the Russian EEZ, and we didn't have the authority to actually board and enforce anything. So, we took documentation, took down all the information, passed that information with a good relationship with Russia through the Kamchatka border guard. And they actually went out, relocated the vessel. As soon as they got into their EEZ, they conducted a boarding. They had 599, and this was a transshipment vessel. They had 599 tons of frozen squid, 136.5 tons of frozen sourdough on board. But through other things with some of the documentation as well as the catch they had on board, the Russians determined that they were illegally fishing, so they seized the catch as well. It's still in port over in Russia right now, pending further legal proceedings, so we'll see what happens with that. But it just highlights the fact that working together is the way we can get this done. Sharing information, working together to curb the illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing activity in the North Pacific Ocean. So what do we need to improve? As I mentioned before, maritime domain awareness is ever changing. We're not 100% sure of what's happening on the ocean at all times, so it makes it harder to efficiently deploy our resources. Okay, the use of technology combines enforceability and regulations. The additional real-time data from various sources, which we talked about today, whether they're autonomous, air vehicles, water, satellite, can be used to more clearly define the problem, and we can provide the information needed to adapt the regulations to fit the enforcement needs, to make sure that we have the right regulations in place, that we can take the right action to curb this behavior. International partnerships to close jurisdiction gaps. I mentioned that before. We have 9 shipwriter agreements that we currently capitalize on, but there's more out there. To be able to capitalize on another nation's assets, but yet be able to use their shipwriters to go out and enforce their laws will make huge inroads. So we need to improve that, and because again, resources are only going to become, as the budget climate the way it is, it's going to be harder and harder to come by. We need to get better at the effort to distill the information into a usable product. As I sit in this room, and as I mentioned about technology, is the Coast Guard, we're very good at what we do, search and rescue and that, but managing technology is something that we're not prone to doing, so we're not experts at it. So it's great to be in a room of smart folks that are out there gathering this information and providing information, so hopefully the Coast Guard can harness that and bring that in and use the information to become better at what we do. Because we spend a lot of time gathering information, doing analysis, and determine where we need to be at the right time. And then just capitalize on the capacity to use these autonomous technologies. Again, our acquisition processes are slow, so we partner with other agencies. We're finally making inroads on that as far as using autonomous technologies, but I think we'll get better at it. So just like updating our computers that I work on for work, maybe we can actually get unmanned aerial vehicles and underwater vehicles to help us do what we do. So how do we get there? How do we get better? I kind of highlighted what we needed to do, but how do we get there? Basically, it comes down to leveraging technology. We talked a lot about AISB. The Coast Guard currently doesn't have an easy way of integrating automatically AISB data. So I just found out yesterday, actually, there's a patch in place, should be coming shortly, but again, we're so far behind that there's information out there. We don't have the ability to bring it into our system and match it with our other information we have to create a usable product. The more we can automate our data analysis, the better we'll get. Again, like as I said, folks that are out flying aircraft, driving ships, doing we're just not manned enough to have this vast use of data analysis and folks that actually do that. So it makes it very difficult. So we need to automate that more so we can spend more time actually out there enforcing rather than doing the analysis. As a chart I showed earlier was right off the coast of California. I think we need to do better at getting information to the Coast Guard that addresses all of the high seas. And hopefully with some of the things I've heard this morning, we're getting fairly close to having real-time information that we can actually use and incorporate in our information gathering process. And then during their satellite connectivity to share data with deployed resources. So we have a lot of resources out there, but to be able to share that information on a real-time basis will definitely help as well. I think we touched on it a couple times. A couple other speakers mentioned the improvement to evidentiary laws, both domestic and international. So the ability to use automated data, whether they're pictures, satellite pictures, to actually do the enforcement piece. It's that red light camera piece. If we could have the red light camera out there that people know that if they're out there, they're going to get caught and they're going to have a ticket that shows up with a picture of their vessel. Maybe they'll stop doing it because they know Big Brother's watching. So with that, that's kind of the Coast Guard, where we currently are, where we need to go, and how we think we can get there. So with that, I guess I don't know if I have time for questions, or I'll be around.
Well, maybe we take one question and then hold the rest for the coffee break that's just coming in.
So you mentioned the latency between the new technology emerging and it's being adopted within the Coast Guard. Do you see the situation changing? And it's clear that it's not the case for the offenders. It's very often that the people in the legal world are getting the very cutting-edge technologies. So do you see this gap narrowing between the time when you know about the technology and the access to it?
I would say the Coast Guard is probably getting better, but it's not because we are getting more resources to be able to get better at acquiring. Because again, with the U.S. government, the way our acquisition process works, it takes multiple years to get to where we need to be. So where we're harnessing that is the recognizing that we don't necessarily have to own the technology, we just need access to it. So it's that sharing of information and partnership. So that's how we're actually trying to gain access to that without actually having to purchase it. So again, whether it's buying airtime on satellites to get real-time data as opposed to actually purchasing the satellites. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you very much. And next I'd like to please invite Neshe Nisha Dimmoduck, who's our account executive for Homeland Security, and my